Eddie was born here in the village of Banstead at the turn of the year 1898 to 1899. He was the son of Jason and Fanny Sopp. Now, Fanny was a local girl. She'd grown up on Perrotts Farm. There were three families living there towards the end of the 19th century before her father retired, and they moved to Mint Cottages, which are some of the oldest houses in Banstead, just on Park Road by the Mint pub. Now, she went to Croydon as a young girl. She was probably working in service, and there she met a young labourer and gardener named Jason Sopp from Inkpen in Berkshire. Now, they married at St James's Church in Croydon, and they came to Banstead. They had a daughter very soon after they were married. Unfortunately, she died just a few months after being born and was buried here at All Saints. After her death, they moved away. They went up to Derby. Jason had a younger brother up there at the time, and so he went up to be near his family there. They lived at sort of opposite ends of Derby at the time. It's not that big a city now anyway, but it was quite a small place at that time, surrounded by these clusters of villages which have now been incorporated into the city itself. And they lived at one of these, what's now a suburb called Chellaston. They went on to have several children while they were up there, moved around a little bit. But they came back to Banstead to be near Fanny's widowed mother, who was still living in Mint Cottages. And they took one of Mint Cottages as well. They were down the far end, down near where Mint House is. And they lived there for a number of years before they moved just up the road in Park Road to Apsley Cottages. Again, some of the oldest houses in Banstead, probably built in the mid-19th century. They lived at number 1, which is on the village, the one nearest the village end of that little terrace. And Eddie was born there. We don't know very much about his early years. We know that he probably went to school in the village, probably left at 14. The only incident we know in any detail at all involved his father. His dad had been at the pub at the Wheat Sheaf. He'd been there with one of his neighbours, Robert Limington. Limington had been drinking for several hours. He was drunk. Jason was sober, or at least allegedly sober. And as they came home down Park Road, they had a bit of a falling out. Now, what exactly happened next it depends on which witnesses you believe. But a confrontation ensued. On Jason's side of the story, he managed to get inside the house, lock the door, but Limington smashed a pane of glass and managed to open the front door and got in and started severely beating Jason, causing him some bad facial injuries. But Fanny managed to escape from the house and go and call the police before any further harm could be done. And this was the story as first presented when they went before the Epsom Police Court. However, Limington asked for an adjournment and got it, and brought 2 witnesses with him who claimed that instead what had happened was that Jason challenged Limington to a fight, stripped to his waist in his front garden, and the 2 men had 2 rounds in the front garden without any conclusion being reached. The magistrate couldn't decide whose story to believe, and so they were both bound over for good behaviour. About this time, Fanny, aged about 42, started to lose her hearing, and she very rapidly went totally deaf. There's a chap that used to live in Banstead, I don't know, some of you might remember him, Jeff Pushman, whose family used to keep a shop up on the corner of Sopps Road. And he remembers Fanny Sopp, and he says that she was a lady who'd gone totally deaf, and she'd start talking in a whisper, and end up in a shout at the end of every sentence. They moved soon to Diceland Road, to number 3, just round the corner from the shop that I was just talking about. It was it still is there today, a semi-detached cottage, one of the oldest houses in the road, just by the junction with Sopps Road. Now, after Eddie had left school, we don't know quite what he did, but when it came to his 18th birthday and the time he was conscripted, he was working as a guard. Now, this was probably a guard on the railway rather than a watchman. Although he had been pretty young to be taking that job, of course, most of the railwaymen had already gone to France, and their jobs were being filled by younger boys and also by women as well, who were all working as guards and in various other duties for the railway, covering for them. So Eddie was called up, and he joined a training reserve battalion. He had about 3 months or so before his official conscription, when he turned 18, and the time he was actually called up for training. So he would have stayed at home, carrying on with his normal civilian life for a couple of months before he was called up to join them. Now, he trained in East Anglia. He went through 3 different training battalions, As you went, you'd graduate from a young soldier battalion up to a graduated soldier battalion. That would be the stage immediately before they sent you overseas. And that's what happened in the autumn of 1917. You transferred to the 52nd Graduated Soldiers Battalion. You had to be 19 years old to be sent overseas to fight. And so when all the boys in his draft class turned 19, they were always, invariably, they'd be shipped out within days, possibly just a couple of weeks at the most, after they had all turned 19. And that's what happened. And they went out to France in March of 1918. Now, they went out, arrived at an infantry base depot at Tarbes, waited a posting to their units. They arrived at a very important, very dangerous time for the British Army. The Germans launched their devastating spring offensive on the 21st of March, just 2 days after those boys arrived in France. Eddie got his posting to his battalion of the Hertfordshire Regiment on the same day that the Germans attacked. His regiment, or his battalion, were busy fighting. They fought for 10 days solid, retreating as they went. They lost about half the men that were serving with them. And they desperately needed reinforcements, but the chaos of the retreat meant that those men waiting at the base depot didn't get sent to join their unit. They didn't actually join them until much later. Eddie didn't ever join them at all. He fell ill, unfortunately, while he was waiting to join his battalion, with tonsillitis, a very easily curable disease. Illness these days, of course, just some antibiotics, and it's probably cleared up in a couple of days. But that infection spread, and he developed blood poisoning, septicemia. And he died in hospital near to where he is buried. His epitaph, chosen by his mother, loved by everyone, and he was 19 years old. Just a year later, his father, Jason, lost his mind. He became maniacal. He attacked Eddie's mother with an axe. And it was only the intervention of a quick-thinking, tactful neighbour that managed to prevent a very serious incident. Unfortunately, Jason was then institutionalised in an asylum for several months, and there he caught dysentery and died soon afterwards, towards the end of 1919. So Fanny had lost 5 of her children and her husband. As she moved away, in came the Oliver family, who I mentioned earlier. Walter Oliver, the man that we commemorated back in 2015, was born in 1895 in Farringdon in Berkshire. His father was a gardener. He came from a family of gardeners. They were all called Frederick or Walter. So his father was Frederick, and Walter's brother was Frederick as well. It all makes it very confusing when you're trying to do the family history, unfortunately. And they all worked as gardeners. They lived in various different places, but they ended up for the longest in Brentford. They lived in Brentford High Street. Now, that was where Walter was living when war broke out, and he joined up just a month after the war broke out, September 1914, and he joined one of the battalions of Kitchener's New Army, and he joined the 9th Service Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers. And sometime very shortly after he joined up with them, the family moved to Banstead. So although he never lived here, the family did have a connection with the village at the time he was serving, which is why he's commemorated here on the War Memorial in accordance with their wishes. Now, his father, Frederick, as I said, was a gardener. He worked at Court House, just over here where St Anne's School is now. And they lived in the lodge on the corner of Court Road and Holly Lane before they later on moved up to number 3, Diceland Road. In fact, the other brother, Frederick, confusing me again, he took number 1, and so the family lived next door to each other in these 2 semi-detached cottages. Now, Walter trained on the home front in some rather chaotic circumstances. There were not enough weapons to go around. We'd never mobilised this many men in such a short time before, so there were not enough weapons to go around. There were no uniforms to go around, so people would be wearing their civilian clothes for months. They get these blue uniforms instead of khaki uniforms when they first got issued, and they didn't like that at all. They were very, very proud, and so regiments would advertise that we wear khaki, you know, as a way of attracting these men to come to enlist with them rather than that other mob. They trained on the home front for several months, and like many of the men of Kitchener's New Armies, they went out in the spring of 1915. They were not supposed to be being used for an offensive for another year, which would be, I suppose, the Somme offensive or the equivalent of that, but needs must. And we needed to launch an offensive in the autumn of 1915. Things were not going so well for the Russians, we needed to stabilise that situation by tying German troops down on the western front to stop them moving to the east. And so we conceived this offensive that was going to take part in the north of France. The French were going to be the major players in this attack, and we were just taking part in a subsidiary attack, what became known as the Battle of Loos. Now, our army commanders did not really want to do this, make this attack, but they had a new surprise weapon. We had gas we're going to use for the very first time, and they thought that maybe, just maybe, if we were to use this with surprise, that we could achieve a stunning victory over the Germans. In the run-up to that battle, Walter and his battalion were busy carrying up supplies, maybe gas cylinders as well, up to the front line, and also carrying up straw, because they were going to line the parapets all along the battlefront and for several miles either side of it with this straw that they would burn at dawn, which would create this smoke screen, mingling with the gas to produce this cloud that the men can then advance safely behind or within. Now, they needed the wind to be blowing in the right direction for this to work. And so the hour was chosen when the wind was going to be the most favourable that it could be, which wasn't particularly favourable at all. It was a very gentle breeze. It wasn't blowing consistently in one direction or the other, particularly. So in some places the gas blew over the Germans and knocked them out, and we achieved successes. In other places it blew backwards behind us, and in other places it just hung over our own troops as they waited to go out. And we gassed hundreds of thousands, possibly, of our own men as we were waiting to, or beginning to make that attack. Now, Walter's battalion, they were just a little bit north of this going on, and they were just holding their position, waiting to see if anything would happen when this attack began on the 25th of September. It was a mixed result. We made some progress. We were kept back to our trenches in some places, and in other places we made some gains further than we were expecting to. And we ended up holding these sort of rather strange shape, not a nice smooth curve to hold or anything like that, this sort of wibbly-wobbly sort of line there. And the Germans were able to bring up their reserves. Our men, as they took these objectives, these features on the flat mining landscape, where every minor rise in the ground or minor fall in the ground was of vital tactical importance. Where our men were gathered in these, having had their numbers depleted, the Germans were able to counterattack in large numbers, and they drove us out of most of these over the following fortnight or so. But in mid-October, we were still holding out in the quarries, on the edge of the quarries near Hulluch, that we gained a foothold in a major German trench there called Stone Alley. It ran along the foot of these quarries. Behind them were these great big depressions in the ground that the Germans could gather troops in where they wouldn't be seen. And they held trenches all the way around the other three sides of these quarries with a major chain of defences behind it. So to get them out of this last remaining 200 yards or so of this trench in front of the quarries, and then allow us to capture the quarries themselves, a bombing attack, a grenade attack rather than an air raid, a bombing attack was needed. Bombs, hand bombs, grenades, were the most effective trench fighting weapon. We didn't have very good ones. Not a pin in those days. You had to strike them with like a matchbox striker that you'd have around your wrist. And in wet weather, of course, they get very soggy, like as a box of matches would, and they just turn to sludge as you try and light anything. And so the bombs, half of the bombs in a misty day, you wouldn't be able to use. And we didn't have very many of them either. The Germans, with their sort of iconic potato masher grenades, are a far more effective weapon. In a bombing fight, we were always at a disadvantage. So a number of bombing squads were gathered from a number of different battalions, including the 9th Royal Fusiliers, and they were going to attack from the north end of this section of 200 yards of trench that they wanted to capture from the Germans. The Germans had barricaded off between the two areas, so we had arranged for a trench mortar to destroy that barricade, and then our bombers would go through, clear the Germans out, seal off the communications trench linked to the main German trench system, establish barricades and consolidate their position. And Walter's battalion, and probably Walter was in this squad, or one of these two squads that were provided by the Fusiliers. Their job was, as soon as the trench mortar had destroyed that barricade, they would climb up out of the trench, run along the side of the British trench, past the barricade, jump down into the German end of the trench, and start fighting. And while they were doing that, the other bombers would be struggling over the remains of that barricade, and they joined them there, and they would all then fight from that point, together. Now, to me, unless you were the first man going over the barricade, I would think that the job of getting up into no man's land and running along the side of the trench was probably the most dangerous dangerous job of the day. And so it proved casualties were very high amongst the men in that group. They fought their way along the trench. The Germans rained bombs down on them. It was described as a desperate struggle. But we secured, or thought we had secured, our objective. The 2 officers leading the attack were lost. 2 officers came to replace them. They were lost too. The senior NCO in charge decided that we probably had reached our objective, although he wasn't sure, and began the process of building a barricade. By the time an officer came up and told him that we hadn't got far enough, it was too late. The barricade was almost finished. We'd lost too many men to resume the attack. A success, a partial success, perhaps. There would be much more fighting over the next few weeks, and we'd be driven out of that position eventually. We'd recapture it again. And the lines would still be roughly where they were that day 3 years later, in 1918. Walter was probably lost that day. He went missing during a period of a week, and it was very probably in that attack when the Fusiliers lost something like 50 men. They wiped out their nucleus of trained bombers from several battalions in that attack. They knew that that was what was going to happen, but they had no choice, and they had to go ahead with it anyway. It would take months to train their specialist replacements. Walter was just 20 years old.
Of prayer of remembrance, Almighty and eternal God, from whose love in Christ we cannot be parted, either by death or life. Hear our prayers and thanksgivings for all whom we remember this day, especially for Eddie Sopp and all those who gave their lives in World War I. Fulfill in them the purpose of your love, and bring us all with them to your eternal joy. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And for our communities, gracious God, we pray for peace in our community this day. We commit to you all the work for peace and an end to tensions, and those who work to uphold law and justice. We pray for an end to fear, for comfort and support to those who suffer, for calm in our streets and cities, that people may go about their lives in safety and peace. In your mercy, hear our prayers now and always. Amen.
When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow we gave out today.
God, grant to the living grace, to the departed rest, to the Church, the Queen, the Commonwealth and all the world, peace and concord. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son and the Holy Spirit, be among us and remain with us always. Amen. Amen.